Welcome to Rustler's Reminiscence, stories of hope, faith, and frontier courage. Let the journey unfold. They laughed when I walked into that lawyer's office. I heard him before I even opened the door. Sterling Maddox's voice, slick as a snake-oiled saddle, carried through the window like music from a saloon piano. "Well, look who's trying." "On civilization," he said. "You got lost on your way to the soup line, Carter?" Laughter followed, harsh and easy. Rufus Callahan wheezed like a man choking on his own smugness. I didn't say a word, just kept my boots moving, slow and steady across that polished floor, and held my hat in both hands like I was clutching the last thing I owned. Which, truth be told, I was. The lawyer, Mr. Elkins, didn't even look up at first. "Name?" "Boone Carter," I said, voice low and dry from the ride. That got his attention. He looked at me, then back down at a paper with a wax seal. He squinted, licked his thumb, and opened the envelope. "Malachi Carter was your uncle?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Mother's side." I hadn't seen him in, well, never, really. He nodded and pushed a single key across the desk. Brass, heavy, worn smooth around the teeth. "This is yours now. Shack in the hills, 20 acres of mostly rock, brush, and bad memory." Sterling chuckled behind me. "Sounds like your kind of palace, Boone." "Legal?" I asked quietly. "Stamped and recorded. Ain't worth much, but it's yours." That's when Sterling stepped up like we were old friends. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, fingers digging into the worn fabric of my coat. "Tell you what," he grinned, "I'll give you $50 for it. Right here, right now. Save you the trouble of hauling yourself up those hills." Rufus added, $50 is more than fair for tumbleweeds and rattlesnakes." I looked at the key in my palm. It glinted like it had just been polished. Not a speck of dust or tarnish. Something about it felt deliberate, like Malachi had waited decades to hand it to someone. "You boys ever meet Malachi?" I asked. "Crazy old hermit," Sterling scoffed. "Used to talk to rocks." "Shot at clouds," Rufus added. I nodded slowly, slipped the key into my pocket, and turned to face them full. "Then I reckon you wouldn't know what $50 is worth to a man like him." I tipped my hat to Mr. Elkins and walked out, leaving their laughter behind. But this time it didn't stick the way it used to. There was something in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time, something like fire. They still saw me as the hungry farmhand who'd never owned more than a busted shovel. Let them. I'd rather be the fool who climbs the hill than the coward who sells it blind. I saddled up my Marai, turned her toward the foothills, and rode out before the sun dipped past the church steeple. Whatever Malachi left behind, he wanted me to find it, and I was done being laughed at. The trail to Malachi's land wasn't marked on any map. It twisted like a drunk snake through the foothills, brushing past cliffs that threatened to swallow man and horse alike. Rocks tumbled under my Mars hooves as we climbed. By the time I saw the roofline peeking through a stand of dying pines, the sky was blushing orange and my mouth was dust-dry dot. It looked like a cabin built by a man who hated people. Crooked porch, half a chimney, one shutter hanging like a broken limb. The place leaned hard to one side like it had taken a gut punch and never stood up straight again. I dismounted slow, unsaddled, and stood staring at it like it might vanish. If I blinked Dot, then I pulled out the key. The lock turned smoother than a whisper. No creak, no resistance like it had been oiled that morning. That was the first thing that made my skin crawl. The second was the air inside. Dot, it didn't smell like a place that had been empty for 20 years. No rot, no mildew. Just dry air and a faint scent of ash. The hearth held cold embers. Not decades-old days, maybe weeks. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. My hand went to the revolver at my side. I moved slow, boots quiet on the warped floorboards. Every creak sounded like a gunshot in my ears. The cabin was single-roomed with a cot in the corner, a cracked water basin, and a crooked table stacked with empty cans and a rusted coffee pot. On the mantel sat a small tin box locked tight, but what really caught my eye was the stone under the hearth. One was a shade lighter than the rest, and the ashes around it were disturbed. I dropped to my knees, brushing away soot with trembling fingers. The stone shifted. Beneath it, something metal glinted. A handle. I didn't open it. Not yet. Not with daylight fading and nerves twitching like live wires. Instead, I sat back on my heels and looked around. The dust on the table was disturbed in spots. A circle of it brushed clean, like something round had been moved. There were scuff marks near the window, too. Someone had stood there recently. I reached into the tin box on the mantel. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle but unburned. My uncle's handwriting, spidery and crooked. There is value in what others discard. Be patient, Boone. You were never meant to serve lesser men. I read it twice, throat tight. That old man had known me better than I thought. Knew I'd never be much of anything under Sterling's boot. The key hadn't just opened a door. It had opened a question I couldn't stop asking. What else did Malachi know? I stoked the fire, careful to leave no light in the window. Sat with my back to the wall, pistol in hand. Just past midnight I heard it. HOOFBEATS. Slow. Deliberate. My fire died to embers as I held my breath and moved to the window. 3 shadows dismounted beneath the trees. One was tall, broad-shouldered. The other 2 thinner, but not small. All armed. Sterling's voice floated on the wind, too soft to make out, but familiar. I didn't wait. Slipped out the back, crouched in the dark, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. They weren't here for a neighborly chat. They were here because something valuable was under that stone, and Malachi had handed me the first piece of it. I lay belly down in the underbrush, not 10 yards from the cabin, watching 3 men I'd prayed never to be this close to without a crowd or a gun at my back. Sterling. Maddox kicked open the front door like he owned the hinges. Rufus followed, lantern in one hand, pistol in the other. The third man was new, wiry, cruel-eyed, moved like a man who never needed to speak loud to get what he wanted. Gunman, the kind hired for one job and one job only. I told you, Sterling muttered, brushing dust off his boots. He's too stupid to see past the weeds. Probably sold the deed already for a sack of beans. Don't bet on it, said the gunman. Farm boys are stubborn when they smell pride. They moved to the fireplace. Sterling knelt and pulled at the same stone I'd found earlier. His hand didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where it was. I felt a chill climb my spine. The stone lifted with a scrape, and he reached down, grunting, as he tugged something heavy from below. I couldn't see clearly, but I heard the soft thud of metal on wood. Sterling grinned like a man unwrapping a fortune. Still here, he whispered. Rufus leaned over, wide-eyed. How much you think's down there? Enough to buy every. Vote west of the Rockies, Sterling said. The gunman spoke then, low and sharp. I don't like this. He was here. That fire was fresh. You saying he saw this? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. The man turned toward the door. If he shows up again, we handle it. You mean scare him off? The gunman stared at Rufus like he'd just grown antlers. I mean bury him in the hills and say, he ran off. Nobody'd ask questions. Sterling didn't even flinch, just stood up and wiped his hands. He's got no friends, no family, No one who'd even notice. They started cataloging what they'd found: maps, ledgers, even a ledger. Book with names I recognized. Business owners, ranchers, politicians. Men who owed Sterling more than money. Men who'd sold him favors. It hit me then. Malachi hadn't just found silver, he'd found leverage. He'd watched Sterling for years, tracked every bribe, every swindle, every quiet deal made under candlelight. And he'd buried it all like treasure. And now those three were digging it up. I stayed frozen in place until their lanterns faded and their horses carried them back down the trail. Only then did I crawl from the brush, legs trembling beneath me. I'd never heard someone talk so casual about killing me. Like I was a problem with a shovel solution, but I had what they didn't. I had heard everything, and I had a chance, maybe the only one I'd ever get, to turn it all back on them. The cabin was quiet again, empty, but not safe. I slipped inside and stared down at the open hatch. The dark below was calling, full of secrets, full of danger. But I'd been poor my whole life, humiliated, overlooked, used. That mine wasn't just silver. It was a second chance, and I wasn't about to let Sterling take that from me. The air down there was cold, dry, and dead quiet. I lit a lantern with shaking hands and climbed through the opening under the hearth, into the black bones of the hill. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders. Malachi must have dug it by hand, chiseling stone in the dark like a man possessed. Roots clawed through the ceiling. Dust hung on the beam of my lantern like old ghosts. I walked hunched, boots scuffing dirt that hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe decades. Then the tunnel widened, and I found it. A cavern, no taller than a man. Walls glinting with veins of silver so thick they looked like lightning frozen in rock. Stacked in the far corner were bars, real silver, not raw ore, clean, stamped. He'd smelted it down. There were boxes, 2 wooden crates, nailed shut, but cracking with age. Inside were ledgers, letters, sketches. I opened one journal and found dates going back 25 years. Each page told a story about Sterling's rise. How he'd weaseled his way into Copper Ridge, bought out the mines cheap when men were desperate. How he'd threatened families, bribed judges, ruined men who dared compete. Malachi hadn't just watched, he documented everything, and then vanished underground. I sat down hard on an overturned crate, stunned. He wasn't mad. He was methodical, patient, and paranoid, for good reason. Among the records was a map of the property showing not just a cabin, but alternate tunnels, dead drops, escape routes. He'd built this like a fortress, or a mousetrap. At the back of one journal was a note, addressed simply, for Boone. You don't get to choose your enemies, boy, but you do get to choose what you do with the truth. Sterling's rot will poison this land. Burn it out, or it'll take root in you too. I closed the journal and sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing on my chest like a mule. This wasn't just about silver. It was about truth, about justice. And about revenge. I took 3 things before leaving: 1 bar of silver, the journal, with Sterling's crimes, and the map. I didn't even make it back to the cabin before I heard hooves again, closer this time. Too close. Voices barked in the distance. Fan out. Check the trees. They were back. Sooner than I thought. I cursed under my breath and slid into the shadows at the mouth of the tunnel. The silver was too heavy to carry at all, and too dangerous to try. I shoved the bar and journal into my saddlebag, covered the hatch with the fireplace stone, and slipped out the back again. This time, the forest didn't feel like cover. It felt like a noose tightening. I could hear Sterling's voice, now sharp, angry, scared. He's here. I know he's here. They knew. They knew I'd seen it all, but they didn't know what I'd taken Dot and if I could make it to town before they caught me. I might just live long enough to bring them down. I ran through the dark like a man already halfway to death. The tunnel behind me was gone, swallowed in shadows and silence. Ahead the trees were thick and unwelcoming, their branches clawing at my coat like they meant to keep me for themselves. My Mari waited where I left her, just past the ridge behind the cabin. She nickered softly when she saw me, like she could smell the fear dripping off my skin. I didn't ride toward town, not yet. I cut east, deeper into the foothills, toward the river basin where the land split like a canyon mouth. It was rough country, no trails, just stone and scrub and hidden gullies. But I'd played here as a boy, back when I'd come looking for arrowheads and snakeskins. I knew how to vanish out here, and more important, I knew where to bury things. Nobody would ever find I found the place just before dawn. A hollow under an old cottonwood, its roots like gnarled fingers sunk deep into the soil. I wrapped the silver bar in oilcloth, sealed the map inside my coat, and buried them together under a pile of rocks slick with dew. Then I mounted up and turned my Mare west toward Copper Ridge. My legs ached. My eyes burned, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. They thought I was a joke, a poor fool with dirt under his nails and no future but the one someone else gave him. But now I carried proof. A journal of sins, names, dates, amounts, enough to send Sterling to a gallows and Rufus right after him. If the law had any teeth left in this town, I'd find out soon. I rode in through the south end, keeping to the alleys and back lanes until I reached the boarding house. That's where I found her Clarabelle kits. She was hanging laundry on the line, her red hair braided back, sleeves rolled high on her arms. She saw me before I said a word, and her face changed. "Boone?" she asked. "What in God's name?" "I need help," I said, dismounting fast. "I got folks trying to kill me." That got her full attention. Inside she poured coffee with hands that trembled just a little. I laid the journal on the table and started talking. Told her about the mine, the silver, Malachi, the cabin, the tunnel. Told her about the things I'd heard, the names, the crimes, the way they talked about burying me like it was Tuesday chores. She didn't interrupt once. When I was done, she opened the journal and flipped through pages like she'd seen death before. "This," she whispered, "this is enough to bring the law down like a thunderclap. We need to move fast," I said. "They'll come looking." Clarabelle stood, crossed to the small safe behind her father's desk, and pulled out an official seal. "My daddy was county judge before he passed. I kept this in case," she trailed off, but I knew what she meant. In case truth needed help getting heard, we wrote an affidavit, swore out every detail I'd witnessed, copied key entries from the journal, stamped it, sealed it. Outside I heard boots on wood. Sterling had found me. We looked at each other, breath tight, fear thick in the room. "Go out the back," Clarabelle said. "I'll stall them." "No," I said. "This ends today." I checked my pistol. Loaded. I wasn't hiding anymore. I'd been chased, mocked, hunted. Now I was done running. Clarabelle locked the affidavit in a tin, strong box, and slipped it under the floorboards, while I took position by the front window. Her hand brushed mine for a moment, brief, warm but steady. "You sure about this?" she asked. I nodded. "Man's got to choose when he stops being hunted." The first knock came hard, not a polite rap, more like someone meant to break the hinges out of spite. Sterling's voice followed. Sweet, fake, oily as ever. "Miss Kitts, morning to you. Forgive the intrusion, but I'm looking for a man. Boone Carter. Seems he's gotten himself confused about what belongs to who." Clarabelle didn't answer right away. Her hands were clenched, so tight her knuckles turned white. "I've seen no one," she called. "And even if I had, I don't take kindly to uninvited guests." Another knock then. The doorknob jiggled hard. "Miss Kitts," came Rufus' voice this time, smug and syrupy. "We're just trying to keep the peace. We've got business interests in the area." "Then conduct them from the boardwalk," she snapped. That's when the third man spoke. "The gunman. Open the door," he said flatly, "or we do." Clarabelle stepped back, hand on her father's old hunting rifle propped behind the door. Then came the sound of boots, more than 3. I peeked through the curtain. Sheriff Briggs, Judge Harrison, Mayor Cortland, all walking down the street like thunderclouds in human form. My heart nearly stopped. Clarabelle opened the door before Sterling could. The man on the porch froze mid-threat. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Sterling." "Rufus, we heard you were disturbing a young lady's mourning." Sterling's face twisted, fast fake smile, vanishing like mist. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is all a misunderstanding." Clarabelle held up the strongbox and handed it to Judge Harrison. "No misunderstanding, Judge," she said. "These men came to intimidate a witness holding proof of criminal conspiracy, blackmail, and attempted murder." Sterling blinked, stunned. "I beg your pardon?" Then I stepped into view, journal in hand. "You don't have to beg, Sterling. Just hope. There's mercy where you're going." The judge opened the journal, flipped through a few pages, then turned to the sheriff. "Arrest them." Sterling lunged foolishly, but the sheriff was quicker. A heavy hand clapped a cuff on his wrist. Rufus tried to run. He didn't get far. The gunman didn't move. He just raised his hands, knowing when he was outnumbered. Clarabelle exhaled hard, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. I didn't realize I was trembling, too, until she reached out and steadied my hand. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said, eyes still on Sterling as they dragged him away. "We did." The law had come to my defense like a rising tide. Not because I was loud or rich or feared, but because this time I had truth in writing, and for once it was louder than his lies. They held the hearing right there, and the general store makeshift benches pulled in, dust swept, lamp oil lit. Judge Harrison wasn't waiting for a courthouse. He said, "Justice doesn't always need polish. Sometimes it needs to bleed." Sterling sat cuffed, flanked by 2 deputies, his face pale and pinched like he'd swallowed vinegar. Rufus kept his eyes down. The gunman had disappeared into custody without a fight-smartest move of his week. Clarabelle stood beside me. I could feel her presence like a steady hand on my back, even without touching. The room was packed now, shopkeepers, farmers, old, men with suspicions finally confirmed. The town that once mocked me now leaned in to hear every word I had to say. I took the floor, held up the journal, and spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes when you got nothing left to lose. "This book," I said, "was written by Malachi Carter, my uncle, a man you all dismissed as a hermit and a lunatic, but he saw what others didn't, and he wrote it all down." I handed the journal to the judge, who opened it before the crowd. I didn't need to read it again. I knew every page by heart now, bribes, forged deeds, threats against families who wouldn't sell their land. Names, numbers, Proof.Clarabelle stepped forward and produced the affidavit, signed and sealed. "I witnessed the confession," she said. "I helped record it." The room went quiet as the judge flipped through the journal. Finally he looked up at Sterling. "Do you deny this?" Sterling straightened in his chair. His voice, when it came, was like a snake hissing in a henhouse. "It's hearsay. fabrication, nothing provable. The judge raised an eyebrow. And yet your name is signed here, repeatedly, alongside land deeds, transactions, payments traced. To your own accounts. Sterling's tongue flicked across his lips. I demand legal counsel. You'll get it, the judge said. After you've been booked and processed in Iron Hollow, where the court isn't bought and the gallows ain't decorative. The mayor spoke next, slow and heavy. We've ignored too much for too long, no more. And just like that, the floor shifted. Not physically, but the weight of power moved. Sterling wasn't feared. Any more he was caught. They took him out through the front door with his boots dragging and his head down. Rufus followed, blubbering about being just a middleman. Number. One listened. I stood still for a long time, unsure what to feel. Clarabelle slipped her hand into mine. You all right? She asked. I don't know, I said. Feels like I just came up from underwater. The judge handed me back the journal. This is yours now, he said. So is the land. The mine, it's all been cleared. You're the rightful heir. The only thing Sterling owned was a bad reputation. The people around me nodded, tipped hats. Some even clapped me on the shoulder like I was someone worth admiring. I wasn't used to that, wasn't used to any of it, but maybe I could be. I looked over at Clarabelle. She gave me a smile that felt like sunlight. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a man who'd finally earned his name. 6 months later, I stood where Malachi once stood on the porch of a rebuilt cabin, no longer sagging or crooked, overlooking the richest silver vein this side of the Rockies. Men worked the mine below like ants across honeyed earth, hammers ringing, carts rolling. But there was no greed in the air, just grit and purpose. These weren't Sterling's men, bought with threats and whiskey. These were townsfolk, neighbors, men and women who once looked at me like I belonged under a wagon. Now they tipped their hats and waved. C-L-A-R-A-B-E. Elle leaned on the post beside me, belly just beginning to round beneath her cotton dress. She'd married me with no fuss, no veil, just a quiet yes, under the same tree where I'd buried Malachi's silver months before. We dug it up together, used part of it to buy tools, pay debts, repair roofs across town. Not $1 left our hands without purpose. Malachi's journals sat inside, preserved and copied, a testament to one man's lonely war against corruption. The judge had offered to send them to the state, but I said no. Copper Ridge needed to remember who they were when no one was watching. As for Sterling, he'd been sentenced in Iron Hollow. 30 years hard labor. Last I heard, he was breaking rocks under a sun that didn't care how many suits he once wore. Rufus had flipped early, traded everything he knew for a lighter sentence. I didn't care. Let them rot or squirm. Their empire was dust now. The land had changed, but so had I. I no longer walked with my eyes on my boots. I looked men in the eye, took pride in calloused hands, stood my ground in the very same office where they once offered me $50 for the deed. I still kept that brass key, hung it by the door, not as a keepsake but a reminder of who I was when this started. A hungry man, a punchline, the town's favorite failure. Now, I was Boone Carter. Landowner. Husband. Soon-to-be father. And every nail in this cabin, every silver glint in the hills, every smile from a neighbor said one thing, loud and clear. I wasn't the fool who took the hill. I was the man who climbed it. And stayed. Thanks for riding with us through another tale from the Old West. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. More adventures are waiting on the trail ahead. See you next time.